بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah. It is a tremendous blessing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He give us any point of connecting to understanding of religion, because as the beloved Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Man yuridillahu bihi khayran yufaqqihhu fi din." Whomever Allah wishes well for, He grants deep understanding of religion. And we ask Allah for deep understanding of religion, but any knowledge of religion is an expression of iradatul khair from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's of Allah's wishing well for His servant, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He realize us in those meanings and their expressions and realities by His grace subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in our class on Maraqi al-Falah, the commentary on Nur al-Idah, we have begun looking at the obligatory acts of wudu, and in the obligatory acts of wudu we have seen the first three of the four obligatory acts, and we touched upon the key related principles, and central in them is to be able to clearly identify the difference between washing and wiping, for example. That's a critical distinction that we need to be able to make. Anything that is washed, the basis is that it's washed completely. The meaning of masah in itself does not have the sense of completeness, right? Unlike ghusl, right? You say masah at-tawila, it does not necessarily have the sense of completeness. It could be because of the al, etc., but the word itself does not necessarily have the sense of completeness in the Arabic language. Now, the reason that's important is the fourth integral is what he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, Imam Mishrumbulali, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi, says, وَالرُّكْنُ الرَّابِعُ مَسْحُ رُبْعِ رَأْسِهِ, wiping a quarter of the head. Now the word rub', you can say it with a sukoon on the ba or a dam, or two dhammas. Right? And in itself, two dhammas are closer to the principles of Arabic usage. Rubu' would be superior to rubu', but both are completely fine. Right? Rubu'u ra'sihi, mashu rubu'i ra'sihi. Now, the ra's in the Arabic language is a'la kulli shay', the highest of anything. And the highest of the human being is our head, but, and the reason, and this is why language is important, is, for example, it's come in tradition that ra'sul ilm makhafatullah. Some people translate the head of knowledge, right? It's not the head of knowledge. It just means the peak of knowledge. Knowledge doesn't have a head, right? Right? In other words, the practical thing is if you're translating Quran, look at a reliable tafsir, because what you're translating is not words, you're translating meanings. If you are translating hadith and you're a careful translator, if you are translating the words of the most eloquent of the eloquent, and you haven't referred to how the ulama have understood it, then the likelihood of you misconstruing the words of the Prophet ﷺ are high. So ra's has these meanings. Now, wiping a quarter of the head, the basis, الأصل في هذا الباب آية التطهير, right? The basis of the of this section, بل أصل كتاب الطهارة. The basis of all the book of purification is آية التطهير or آية الطهارة. In one verse, you have the rulings of wudu, of ghusl, of tayammum, and beyond, and the hikmat al-tashri', and more than that, and the legal cause for what is a legal cause requiring wudu and ghusl, and the removal of filth. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says regarding wiping the head, وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ. Now, in the Hanafi school, the requirement is a quarter. Broadly, there are two ways the Hanafis have made istidlal on this. The more rigorous and the al-aqyas bimadhab al-imam is what is the indication of the verse itself, because that's a qat'i text, right? And Imam al-Tahtawi gives a nice summary explanation, right? Rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi, right? The ba here is lil-ilsaq, of connecting one thing to another, right? Literally the idea of with, right? So literally, if you read the verse literally, which is the basis of reading something, and rhetorical meanings are understood from literal meanings, وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ. Wipe with your heads, literally. وَامْسَحُوا ba. They say al-ba' تدخل على الآلة. So if you're wiping with the head, what are you wiping? What are you wiping? The hand. Right? So it's as if it's saying, wipe with your heads. What are you wiping? As if the literal meaning from which a meaning is understood is wipe with your heads, your hands. Right? The ba tadkhulu ala, as if the head is the means of wiping the hand. Now, mash is wiping, has a sense of imrar, right? Of passing something over another. So if you place your hand on your head and you wipe your hand with your head, the least that would be considered wiping in the language, which you place, just try it for a moment, right? Place your hand on your head and move it just the slightest. Where do you get to? Half your head, like the top half of your head, right? Right? The slightest motion will get you to the top half of your head, and the top half of your head is a quarter of the total head, because the head has a front, a back, and two sides. وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ. Right? As if wipe with your heads, your hands. The least that would be considered wiping would be wiping the front of your hand. Right? Place it on it. It's the slightest motion. Right? And that's basically a quarter. What's been related is the nasiya in the hadith of the Prophet. So the rigorous way, and the books of Hanafi Istidlal discuss that. Imam al-Tahtawi summarized it really beautifully, right? In his right, and from the usuli perspective and so on, with clear language. But the ba, right, enters into the tool in this kind of usage, right? So as if it said, وَامْسَحُوا أَيْدِيَكُمْ بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ. Right? Wipe your hands with your heads. As if it were. Right? Which would be, wipe the front part of your head. That's normally where the wiping takes place. That's the more rigorous way. Another way, which is less rigorous, is what Imam Shumbulari takes. And of course, that does not mean that Imam Shumbulari thinks this is the superior reasoning, but it's a simpler reasoning. Right? Which is that the ayah is mujmala, the ayah is non-detailed, والبيان أتى من صاحب البيان سيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم. The verse does not explicitly detail how much you have to wipe. The least that is established of how much to wipe from the Prophet ﷺ is مقدار الناصية. So he says لمسحه صلى الله عليه وسلم ناصيته الشريفة عليه الصلاة والسلام. Because of his wiping صلى الله عليه وسلم his noble front of the head. And الناصية هي مقدم الرأس. Right? Right? So now the ulama differed. Is the nasiya the same as a quarter of the head? Some said yeah. But the tahqiq, wallahu a'lam, is the nasiya is less than a quarter of the head. So where is the quarter understood from? Right? And there's some said no, a quarter is the nasiya, but no, and when they detail the aqwal, because there's at least 6 positions on how much you wipe. Right? Imam al-Tumurtashi, the author of Tanwir al-Absar, in his commentary on Zad al-Faqir, breaks it down a little bit as his teacher, Sahib al-Bahr, Ibn Nujaym, broke it down. So there's a number of positions. The relied upon position is a quarter of the head, and that's what, and Imam al-Kasani in Badai' al-Sana'i' said that all other narrations from the Imam are marju' anha. He left those positions. Or they can be, one can make tawjih of them in different ways, right? And so there's a way you can gather most of them together, because the nasiya is masaha nasiyatahu. So the nasiya is the front of the head. If you do wiping of it, you move the hand even the slightest. Like, a legal wiping, if I did this, would you say I wiped my head in the language? You say I put my hand on my head. Now legally the meaning of wiping is attained. I go like this, I've legally wiped, but in the language, would you say I wiped my head if I put my hand like this? No. Wiping, even in English, has a sense of moving. If I did this slightly, say, he wiped his head slightly, right? So if I placed my hand on the nasiya and I wiped, means I moved my hand a little bit. So that's why the ruba technically is a little more than the nasiya, ala tahqiq. Now there's another opinion that it's ثلاث أصابع, 3 fingers. Because wamsahu, because the least, that للأكثر حكم الكل, right? Wipe your hand. And because you are making تقدير, التقدير من باب الضرورة ويقدر الأقل. فما أقل ما يطلق عليه اسم اليد. What's the least that is considered hand? Less than 3 fingers would not be considered hand, according to the Arabs. Right? Right? Would you call this my hand? No. Would you call this my hand? But I said this you'd call, the Arabs at least would call this the hand. Right? Right? So understanding of the riwayah of ثلاث أصابع is that it can be argued min bab al-jama' is that's referring to the least that you can wipe with, because less than that is not considered sufficient. the other line of reasoning is the Prophet wiped his nasiyah. That's bayan lil mujmal. And that's used by some, amongst them, Mullah Ali al-Qari in Fath Bab al-Inaya, if I recall correctly, but al-Hifz Kha'in, he discusses that. So that's the basis of reasoning. But the most rigorous and the usuli component is important for that. What I explained is detailed out, and you can, if you want to take good notes on it, you can see what Tahtawi has to say about that. Rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi. Right? Okay. And the istidlal from the verse, from the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, the hadith, there's many hadiths in Sahih Muslim and elsewhere related to this, comes from the fact that most of the narrations of the Prophet ﷺ either mention that he wiped his head, meaning all of it, or they describe his wiping from the front of his head to the back, ila al-qafa. Right? So most of the narrations mention isti'ab. But the least that is mentioned is أنه مسح ناصيته. So, but that too, you would say there's no contradiction between nasiyah and the ruba' in that sense because of the madlul of masih. Because what's the meaning of masih, of wiping? This placing would not in the language be considered wiping, but legally would be if you placed enough. Right? Okay. وتقدير الفرض بثلاثة أصابع مردود. As for the definition of the obligation as being to wipe the extent of 3 fingers, meaning off the head, is rejected. Right? Because it doesn't work in terms of riwayah from riwayatan, and when they say in our books, when they say riwayatan, meaning an a'immatina, they don't mean riwayah an Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Riwayatan ay an riwayatu aqwali a'immatina. Aw dirayatan, or in the legal meaning, that if you were to look at the interpretive principles of the madhab and apply them, which is something the imams of the madhab can do, we just explain what they say. That's dirayatan. That it's looking at what are the applicable usul of the madhab. It doesn't work either. Where did the 3 fingers come from? Right? Okay. وَإِن صُحِّحْ, even if it has been deemed valid. وَإِن صُحِّحْ, and this is lil-istibad, even it has been deemed correct by some, it's a minority and it's lil-istibad. But the benefit of riwayat like this, someone said, all I used to do is I used to hit my head with 3 fingers because, my old aunt, that's how she taught me to make wudu. They say, well, there's a qawl musahhah in the madhab, so هذا يرفع القضاء, but لا يجوز العمل به. But you can't act upon that nor teach it. It does not represent the madhab. And you can see the different aqwal and so on there in the places mentioned. وَمَحَلُّ الْمَسْحِ مَا فَوْقَ الْأُذُنَيْنِ, the place of wiping is above the ears, right? Meaning that's حده من الجانبين ومن مؤخر الرأس. From 3 sides, the limit is the ears. From the front, the limit is obvious, because the head begins where the forehead finishes. يعني وراء سطح الجبهة, from beyond the top of the forehead is head, and then from the sides is ما فوق الأذنين. ومحل المسح ما فوق الأذنين. Right? So if one wiped other places, that's not considered head. فيصح مسح ربعه لا ما نزل عنهما. So it's valid to wipe a quarter of any part of the head, So I've been asked a few times. Some guys asked me, I'm a salesman. I gel up my hair in a particular way. And if I wipe my head for wudu, it spoils the gel. Figure out some other hairdo, right? But you can do the sides of your hair. Or figure out some other gel to use. Like, that's a separate thing, right? But if you wipe the sides of your hair or the back of your head, a quarter of the back of the head, it's valid too. Or practically, someone has dry skin. So the front of my head has dry skin. Okay, wipe the back of your head. Simple, right? Right? فلا لا ما نزل عنهما, not that which falls from beyond them, right? فلا يصح مسح أعلى الذوائب المشدودة على الرأس. So it's not valid to wipe on the tops of braids if you've tied them on your head. Let's say someone has braids and they gather the braids on their head, so they're wiping on their head, but those braids, if let go, fall below the top of the ear. That's not head. That's not head. Right, that can apply to women if they put their hair in a mega bun or something. Right? Why they do it, that's not our problem. But if they did it, then wipe on hair that, if were to be loose, would be above the head, above the ears. Okay. وَهُوَ لُغَةً. Okay. وَهُوَ, what is the huwa going back to here? المسح. وهو أي المسح لغة إمرار اليد على الشيء. Right? Wiping, مسح in the language is passing your hand over something. Right? وشرعا إصابة اليد المبتلة العضوة. Right? This is an example. أصاب يصيب إصابة. This is an اسم مصدر, right? And it takes إصابة اليد المبلولة العضوة. It takes a مفعول, right? Correct? Correct? Good. إصابة, for a wet hand to أصابة, to come upon, a wetted hand. مبتلة, ابتلة is to become wetted. يبتل فهو مبتل وهي مبتلة. Right? إصابة, for a wetted hand to come in contact with a limb. Okay. Now, إصابة اليد المبتلة العضوة, the qaid here of al-yad is ittifaqi. The condition of the hand here is incidental. Right? Right? Because let's say some random brother went and bought his wife lots of fancy roses, got 64 fancy roses. So she had just finished washing her hands. She just washed her hands. She says, "You silly man." And she slapped him a few times on his head with wet hands. Her hands hitting his head would be mash al-ra's for him. Right? If she was wetting a cloth to clean the table with, and she hit him on the head with the wet cloth, don't get bad ideas, married folk. Right? She hit him on the head with a wet cloth. Is his head wiped? Yes. I mean, this doesn't fulfill the sunnah of wiping, and certainly not the sunnah of family relations, but it fulfills the sunnah, it fulfills the fard. That's why the Imam al-Tahtawi mentions this as well, actually. Right? إصابة, when he says قوله إصابة اليد إلى آخره, Imam al-Tahtawi رحمة الله عليه says الأولى ما ذكره غيره بقوله وشرعا إصابة بلل is for wetness to reach. Right? Imam صاحب الدر مولانا الحسكفي رحمه الله He says, يعني المسح إصابة البلة العضو. البلة العضو. Okay, that's a brief, precise, complete definition. إصابة البلة العضو. For wetness to reach the limb. Yes, salam. But you mentioned the tool because most of the time, what are you going to wipe with? How often have you wiped your head without using your hands? You've never done it? Yeah. You could. If you want to practice, you could wet your forearm and upper arm, right? And you could go like this. Did you use your yed? No. You could take one of the handkerchiefs, one of these cloth handkerchiefs at Seekers, wet those, and hit your head 3 times or 4. And you could actually, if you want to be fancy, you could spray water inside your cap, go like this, and it would do it too. So the definition is fulfilled, right? But here, they also say al-ibratu lil-ghalib. So this type of condition is called qayd ittifaqi, an incidental condition, right? Okay. Now there's a question mark. People don't realize this. What if I washed my arms? Now, after washing my arms, I've been washing. Are my hands wet? Normally, yes. So after washing my arms, what if I wipe my head without taking new water? Very conceivable. Wash both arms, wipe the head, didn't take new water. So he says, right? وشرعا إصابة اليد المبتلة العضوة ولو بعد غسل عضو, even after washing a limb, كاليدين, like washing both arms. ولو بعد غسل عضو لا مسحه, أي لا بعد مسحه, أي ولو كان المسح بعد غسل عضو, even if the wiping is after washing another limb, right? Right? لا مسحه, right? ولو بعد ولو بعد غسل عضو من غير أخذ ماء جديد, right? Without taking new water, right? You wash the arms, just wipe the head without taking new water. This opinion says this is valid, and this is أحد قولين. This is of one of 2 opinions in the madhab. وهو الأوسع, and it is more expansive. لا ببلل أخذ من عضو, not with moisture that was taken from elsewhere. So you washed your arms, but then you dried them. So your beard is dripping wet. Do you want to wipe your head? You go, you rub your beard, and then you wipe your head. Right? You can't do that. But if there's still dripping wet water on your hand, you could just use that to wipe your head. Right? والأحوط التزام أخذ ماء جديد للمسح, right? And the more cautious opinion is to hold oneself to taking fresh, like to take water. One it's sunnah, but also للاختلاف في صحة ذلك, right? And this is not explicitly come in ظاهر الرواية, but the ulama of the madhab differed on it on 2 opinions, going back to legal reasoning that's way beyond our limited scope, but some of the ulama deemed it to be valid. That's what Imam Shumbulali takes, and that's al-awsa. But al-ahwat, and it's great imams of the madhab have said no, labudda min akhdi ma'in jadid. So if someone says I always used to do this, khalas, it's not just not Imam Shumbulali, but a great number of the imams of the madhab took that opinion, and هذا يسع الناس. But practically, don't do this. Don't do this. Do what you're normally doing, which is after washing your arms, do you take fresh water to wipe the head? Yes, do it. Right? So don't learn lack of caution from fiqh, but rather learn caution. Right? And you get rewarded for that. Because before you didn't know that this is being cautious, but once you know it's cautious and you choose to be cautious, you are rewarded for that niyyah. Right? And this is min, and you thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for that ni'mah. Right? Because you did the same thing as someone else, but you need al-ilm, بالمنوي is من أسباب الثواب على النية. من أسباب الثواب على النية. Okay, but you cannot do that with wetness you take from some other limb, right? Right? Because the condition for valid wiping is not wipe with used water, right? Okay. وإن أصابه ماء أو مطر قدر المفروض أجزأه. And if when أصابه إن أصاب العضو ماء أو مطر, if the limb is is wetted with is affected by water or rain to the extent of the obligation, it is valid, right? It is valid and sufficient. أجزأه, it is sufficient. But as-sunnah nafsul masih, right? The sunnah is the actual wiping, to use the hand to wipe completely. We'll see the sunnah, right? Okay. Then he promised in the beginning that there are a number of things related to wudu. So he says, وَسَبَبُهُ إِسْتِبَاحَةُ مَا لَا يَحِلْ بِهِ. Right? So the sabab, it's cause. Like what would cause you to make wudu. Right? He says, السبب ما أفضى إلى الشيء من غير تأثير فيه. Right? The cause is is that which leads to another matter without having an effect in it. Right? What is the cause? Meaning, and the sabab is why you did something. The cause is why you did something. But the cause does not affect the action itself. Right? I want to make wudu. I want to be in a state of ritual purity. Did that affect the wudu at all? No. As opposed to the illah. The illah, because there's the general cause, the illah is the effective cause. Like khurujul najasa, someone sitting and gas comes out. That's the exiting, the occurrence, so there, or for example, blood comes out, right? So I gashed myself with my fountain pen, blood came out, khurujul najis. Right? That is the illah, right? The illah, the effective cause, leads to breaking wudu, but the illah affected the matter. Right? Right? And that's a discussion of usul. What's the difference between a sabab and a illah? And if someone wants to read a little on it, and أفضى إلى شيء, أفضى إلى is ما أوصل إليه, right? That which leads to another thing, right? Right? As for the illah, the effective cause, it has an effect on the validity of what it's an effect for. They say إذا وجدت العلة وجد المعلول. Right? So they say الحكم يدور مع علته إثباتا ونفيا. A ruling revolves around its effective cause in affirmation and negation. If the illah is found, the matter is found. If not, it's not. So you made wudu. What's the legal way? There's two ways of thinking. Do I have wudu? Right? The faqih would tend towards thinking, okay, did any of the ma'ani and naqida lil wudu all take place? The usuli would say, what is the illah of naqd al-wudu? Khurujun najasa. Haqiqatan or hukman. Is the exiting of filth. Did it take place? Nope. Right? So that's more direct. Because the faqih looks at the furu', the usuli would look at what's the illah. Or the intelligent faqih would also look at the usul. So of course that's one of the arguments why the usulis try to come up with several arguments why usul al-fiqh is higher than fiqh. The fuqaha said, whatever. You're just explaining what we're already affirming. Right? So faqih al-haqiqi لابد أن يكون أصوليا. Anyways. So what is the reason for what is the reason? The sabab here you can translate as reason. Right? استباحة ما لا يحل إلا به is to make permitted that which is not permitted without it. استباحة أي إرادة فعل, right, is to seek to do an action. ما أي شيء يعني يكون ما يكون أي شيء يكون من صلاة ومس مصحف وطواف is to make permitted that which is not permitted. لا يحل الإقدام عليه to begin إلا به except with it, except with wudu أي الوضوء. وهو أي حل الإقدام على الفعل متوضئا حكمه الدنيوي. وهو, right, and this, right, this is its legal ruling, right? الحكم, what is meant by the حكم is الأثر المترتب على الشيء. Right? The hukum, the ruling of something is what is the matter that is entailed by another. Right? وهو أي استباح يعني is حل يعني الإقدام على الفعل is the permissibility of performing an action in wudu, with its condition of wudu. حكمه الدنيا is its worldly ruling. المختص به المقام, that relates specifically to this station, because fiqh looks at the outward worldly rulings of matters. Things have four, right? Any given thing has four rulings, right? Because the ruling of something, there's a dunyawi aspect and an ukhrawi aspect. And both have an outward and an inward. So the outward aspect of our actions, the faqih, insofar as the domain of the ilm al-fiqh, looks at al-ahkam al-dunyawiyya al-zahira, the worldly rulings that are outward. Tasawwuf looks, in part of it, at the inward rulings related to our outward actions. Or ilm al-akhlaq, or whatever, but tasawwuf, right? Ilm al-ihsan. It is the inward qualities of our outward action. So there's the outward and inward in worldly terms, and then in the akhirah, there's outward rulings in the akhirah, thawab, etc. And there's an inward ruling which is rida Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so that's how some of them have explained it. Of course, you can argue across the board about those things, but this is okay. Right? وحكمه الأخروي الثواب في الآخرة, and its ruling in the next life is الثواب في الآخرة, is reward in the hereafter. That's the outward, next worldly ruling. Right? Of course, he says إذا كان بنيته, if it's done with intention. وهذا حكم كل عبادة, right? And that is the ruling of every act of worship, right? That the act of worship fulfills the worldly duty. If done, the reward is, and there's a قاعدة لا ثواب إلا بالنية, right? There's no reward without intention, right? وشرط وجوبه, and the condition for it being obligatory, أي التكليف به, meaning to have moral responsibility for it, وافتراضه, and it being obligatory, so being morally responsible for it, and for it to be obligatory. Now, there's two types of shurut broadly. There are two types of shurut mentioned here. The shurut al-wujub and shurut al-sihha, conditions for obligation and conditions of validity. If the conditions of obligation are not fulfilled, you don't have to do the action. It's not obligatory on you. If the conditions of validity are not found, you had to do it. But now, logically, you could do it, you could fulfill one and not the other, and not fulfill one and do the other. Like, so there's actually four logical possibilities. Because an action could be obligatory, you could fulfill the conditions of obligation and fulfill also the conditions of validity. You might not fulfill the conditions of obligation, right? But fulfill the conditions of validity. It's far-fetched, but it's possible. And vice versa. نسأل الله العافية. شروط وجوبه العقل is sanity, right? إذ لا خطاب بدونه, because there's no address. أي لا خطاب شرعا بدونه, because there's no legal address. You're not addressed. Because the hukum, like the hukum shar'i, has these four aspects. There's the hakim, al-mahkum, there's the hukum, the mahkum bihi, right? The mahkum alayhi, and the sigha al-hukum, right, which is a specific text. So, but usually they mention four. There's there's the lawgiver, the one who's addressed by the law, the mahkum. There's the ruling itself, and there's what the ruling relates to, and how the ruling was expressed. To the mahkum, these are conditions related to the mahkum. Wal bulugh, and puberty. لعدم التكليف لعدم تكليف القاصر أي من كان دون البلوغ, because there's no moral responsibility for the one who's below puberty. وتوقف صحة صلاته عليه لخطاب الوضع, right? And because the validity of his prayer depends on now there's an issue with that, right? Because the validity of the prayer of the child, right, or the non-baligh, right? What do you have in your copy, Omar? What does it say? right? Because the validity of the prayer depends on. Now, there may be something in the text here, Allahu Alam, right? Right? Because the prayer of the non-baligh is non-obligatory, right? But if they're mumayyiz, it's sahiha, right? Yuthab alayha. The prayer of the non-baligh is valid and they're rewarded for it. That's the mu'tamad. والإسلام and Islam إذ لا خطاب يعني إذ لا يخاطب إذ لا يخاطب كافر بفروع الشرع, right? Because the non-Muslim is not addressed with the details of the Sharia, right? There are various aspects. هل الكفار مخاطبون بفروع الشرع? Are non-Muslims addressed by the details of the law? Now, what do we mean by this? There's fi dunya and there's fi akhirah. In worldly terms, no, we don't hold non-Muslims responsible for the detail of the Sharia in this world. The khilaf is about the hereafter. That, a disbeliever, would they be punished for disbelief plus not following the rules of the Sharia, or just for their disbelief? And there's two opinions on this, two main opinions, right? And right? So, and the argument for those who said that yes, they're addressed with it in the hereafter is why? ما سلككم في سقر قالوا لم نكن من المصلين. We were not of those who prayed. Now, does that refer to al-musallin are al-mu'mineen? Right? We were not of those who pray, i.e., we were not of the believers. So is the punishment there for them not praying or not being from the believers whose wasf is that they pray? Right? And both possibilities exist, which is why the khilaf exists. Right? And that's, but in worldly terms, as is related from Sayyidina Umar, umirna natrukahum wa ma yadinun. We've been commanded to let them be and what they hold to be correct. And now we give them nusх, كذا رعاية للمصالح الدنيوية. We give them advice, with the principles of advice, because we care about their good, even in worldly terms. Right? وقدرة المكلف على استعمال الماء الكافي. وقدرة المكلف, and the ability of the one morally responsible to use water. الطهور, that is purifying. لا إن عدم الماء والحاجة إليه تنفيه حكما فلا قدرة إلا بالماء. Right? There's no لا وجوب إن عدم الماء. Right? There's no obligation if there's no water. I mean, there's no obligation for water, rather for wudu. Rather, you'd make tayammum. لا if there's haja ilayhi, there is water, but you have need for the water, which are the conditions for tayammum, right? That you have water, but it's ma'doom hukman, because you need it to drink, for your essential needs, right? بقدر ذلك. Right? والحاجة إليه تنفيه حكما, and the need for it, for water, negates its presence effectively. Right? وخلة الاستعمال الكافي حقيقة أو حكما. Right? Al-kafi, sufficient water, because let's say if you only have this much water, is this enough to make wudu with? No. So this would, so if someone only had this much water, the shart of wujub is not found. Right? Al-kafi لجميع الأعضاء, that is sufficient for all one's limbs. مرة مرة, once. وغيره كالعدم. And other than this, an non-purifying water, or water that is present but needed for essential needs, or insufficient water. وغيره أي غير الماء الكافي المقدور على استعماله حقيقة وحكما كالعدم, is as if it's not there. ووجود الحدث, and the presence of ritual impurity. فلا يلزم الوضوء على الوضوء. Right? Wudu upon wudu is not required. And this is one of the dispensations that emerged from Sayyidah Aisha radiallahu anha. Before, the Muslims would make wudu for every prayer. Right? But then the dispensation came, and initially they were upset why she delayed them, but it was said of her that truly you are a blessed woman, right? Because the dispensation came that you don't have to make wudu for each prayer. Right? فلا يلزم الوضوء على الوضوء. وعدم الحيض وعدم النفاس, and not to be in a state of hayd, of menstruation, or postnatal bleeding. بانقطاعهما شرعا, by them ceasing شرعا, right? وضيق الوقت, and restrictedness of the time, right? لتوجه الخطاب مضيقا حينئذ, right? Because then the address becomes constrained, because there's يجب بدخول الوقت وجوبا موسعا. When the time comes in, right, prayer becomes obligatory upon you. وجوبا موسعا, you have the time to pray, right? And if you don't have wudu, you have the whole wudu, your whole prayer time to make wudu in. But if you get towards the end of the time, such that there's only enough time to make wudu and pray and complete the prayer before the ending of the time, then this is يضيق الخطاب. Now you're being told, pray now, because if you didn't, you'll disobey the divine command. So that's لتوجه وضيق الوقت لتوجه الخطاب مضيقا. Then it becomes ضيق, becomes constrained. You have to do it now, right? حينئذ وموسعا في ابتدائه. And the khitab is موسع, it's expansive. When the time comes in, you have to pray, you have the whole prayer time. Outside, while accounting for karaha. وقد اختصرت هذه الشروط في واحد. Said, I have summarized all these 8 conditions in one expression. وهو قدرة المكلف بالطهارة عليها بالماء. Right? Right? It's the ability of the morally responsible person to engage in purification with water. Right? That subsumes the other conditions. وشرط صحته أي الوضوء ثلاثة. And the conditions for its validity are 3. We'll stop there. وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. So we'll look at the conditions for validity, and there's a few issues that arise from that in our times, and also particularly with nail polish and stuff. And تمام أحكام الوضوء, and the completion of the أحكام of wudu. And then we get to the sunnahs of wudu. وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وآله وصحبه وحزبه والحمد لله رب العالمين. Any questions? Yes.
So you mentioned that wetness reaching the head, whatever the means, suffices for wiping with the hands. But doesn't that go against the Maraqi?
What?
Wipe your hands with your hand.
Means you wipe the extent of the hands, which is the yad is not maqsuda anyways. And that's from أسرار الخطاب الإلهي. وامسحوا برؤوسكم. The yad is غير مقصودة. It's not actually mentioned. Right? And one of the asrar of that khitab is wipe the extent of your hands. And that's from the many of the indications of the text that a number of the ulama have tried to do extensive tafsir of ayat al-tahara. A mid-sized extent of it is mentioned by Imam Badruddin al-Aini in Umdat al-Qari, but he just gathers some of the rulings understood from it. But from it is that the yad is not مقصودة لعينها.
Is the definition of إصابة القبلة, does that apply for the khuf, for the jawrab?
Yeah, that's everywhere. Yeah. Okay.
When we mentioned that
Like one would kicking a soccer ball, make your wudu complete. Yeah. Right? If you were wearing khufs and you made wudu, but you hadn't yet wiped your feet, and you started playing soccer with a wet soccer ball, if you hit the soccer ball twice, you've wiped sufficiently. And of course, the definition of tayammum mentions the yadayn, right? But it's not. There's actually a lot of ishkal around that, because it is there, but it's just وسيلة تحقيق معنى الضربتين. Right? You have an issue with that? What? Yeah, that's in مسح بها. There's a lot of ishkal around that. And if you, even I think in his commentary he discusses that. You know, when for what? For the khuf or the tayammum? For tayammum, yeah. Yeah, yeah. And that's discussed in. Anyways, we'll stop there because we need to pray.